Okay, it's 11 o'clock, so let's get going here. Assignment number 4, I have posted that to the course website. We will talk about that during our next class. It will be over the next main topic that we will have here. So today we have a guest speaker, Leanne Marshall, a UNL alumnus from 2008. She received her master's degree here. Leanne is originally from the Denver area, and after graduating, spent some time still in Nebraska, and they just recently moved back to Denver. So I guess with that then, I'll let Leanne come on up here and do her presentation. There you go.
Hi, everyone. So I'm just here to talk to you today a little bit about what I do since graduation and kind of what my everyday looks like at my current job. And I do have time for questions afterwards. So this is just kind of what I'm going to go through today, my background, what I've been up to, what my day at work looks like, experiences here at UNL that helped me in my current career, things I wish I had learned at UNL, and then other opportunities in a similar field to mine in statistics, and then just general advice that I have. All right, so as Dr. Builder mentioned, I did go to UNL. I also got my undergrad degrees here in math and sociology, and I also did a minor in statistics. So I just took some of the 400 level undergrad classes. 2008, graduated with my master's, and then from 2008 to 2015, I worked for First National Bank in Omaha, and I had several roles there that I'll go through. And then in 2015, we moved back to the Denver area, and I now work for Nordstrom for the credit card. So when I first graduated, I really knew that I wanted to go into the banking industry. I had looked at also some roles in insurance, but we knew we wanted to stay here. I was just getting married, and my husband was in the National Guard here. So we knew this was the area that I needed to look for jobs in. So when I first interviewed with First National Bank, I was offered a position in their decision sciences team, which is all modeling for the credit card side of the bank. So in that role, my main focus was working on response models and designing campaigns for the marketing side of the bank. So it was, you get credit card offers every day in the mail. So it was really designing targeting. So that's what the models were for. What types of profiles of customers are more likely to respond to what types of offers. So some people revolve balances on credit cards. So they're more likely to accept an offer maybe for 0% interest for some extended period of time. Some people really like to transact on credit cards. So they're more likely to take rewards offers. You get double points when you spend $1,000 types of things. So we did a lot of testing. So that's where the campaigns came in. We do a lot of experimental design, creating maybe 12 different types of groups to test with different profiles of customers in those groups. We'd send out offers, see who responded, then we'd do a lot of profiling on the types of customers that responded. And then we'd also do performance analysis on those people. So then after the campaign ended, we'd watch those accounts for the next 12 months and see how they performed and if we wanted to continue rolling out those type of tests or if there was something that made those tests not profitable for the bank.
So with respect to experimental design stuff, were there particular named experimental designs that you use that you would have learned about in 802? Or?
No, I don't remember. Yes, it was definitely, I definitely applied things that we learned in 802.
I guess I never really even thought of that experimental design applied in that format. I mean, I get those credit card offers from First National Bank. I get them all the time, and I guess I am one of their not successes.
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, what is the success rate with those kinds of credit card offers?
So typical response offers, like for a national offer like that, is just over 1%. So it's not a lot, but hundreds of thousands of offers go out.
Sure.
So, that's a lot of the piece in the experimental design as well, is sampling. How many people do we have to send it to get enough customers to respond to be able to evaluate the performance?
So I would think that probably weird things would happen because the response rate is so small. I mean, I guess if you do have a large enough sample size, in the end, it's going to be okay. But
Yep.
if you don't,
there's a lot of that considered. So, there would be several different variables that we would look at. We would look at testing different APRs, different reward offers, so there would be all these different variables. So you'd go through your whole experimental design, get all your different combinations, and then we would have to narrow it down to, let's say, 6 different combinations that we could actually send into market. So that there was all that consideration of, one, not sending too many offers to the same people, which, you get a little bit
I'm an
of
outlier in their database, maybe.
Right. You get a little bit of that fatigue, though, right?
Yeah.
Like, you keep seeing it, and it's just like, oh, I won't write another offer. But then you also have the people that it's like, oh, well, I've received 4 offers now. Maybe I should actually open this one. So, I mean, it is one of the biggest parts of the credit card industry, though. It's just basically blind mailing. But you get a lot of information on those customers, too. There's a lot of companies that sell data on people. So the credit card industry is purchasing that data and then trying to mine through that data to determine the best customers to target.
So is a logistic regression model for this purpose?
Yes.
That's a common?
Yeah. So most of them is a responder or non-responder type of model.
Okay.
So after I had worked for about a year in that department, there was actually a new department created in the consumer lending side of the bank. So I was moved to a different team to be a statistician/analyst for the consumer lending side. They didn't have a team at all when I moved over there, so it was a lot of learning and some creating our own work. I would say a lot of napkin math had been done prior to analysts starting. There was a team of 4 of us. So it was just really a lot of learning the data, creating databases because there just weren't any. So that was quite an interesting role. That side, we were much more involved in changing policy for the bank. So I did a lot of just kind of what we call ad hoc analysis on one of the big projects I worked on was forecasting losses for the bank. So this was in a time, I moved to that role in 2009. We were just starting the recession. There was a lot of unknowns. First National Bank has been a very healthy bank. Up until that point, there was very little in losses, so there wasn't really a whole lot of data to look at to predict if people were going to go bad or not. And by go bad, I mean they just stopped paying their bills. The terminology in the industry is they charge off. So once you've gone 6 months delinquent on a bill, the bank has to write it off as a loss. Then you go to collections agencies and so on to try and recover as much money as you can. But the bank has to take that as a loss after 6 months. So that was a really interesting role. I got to work with auto loans, mortgages, home equity loans, really just all of the consumer type loans. And it's very different from the credit card industry. Credit card industry has a lot of data. There's a lot more people. And unsecured lending is what credit cards would be, so you don't have any collateral. So unsecured lending, the lines of credit are a lot lower. You have a $3,000 line on your credit card or an $8,000 line. When you're talking consumer lending, you have a $40,000 car loan. You have a $150,000 mortgage. So you're talking about a lot bigger balances, but then you're also talking about collateral. So when you have a mortgage, you put your house up for collateral. If you go bad on that loan, the bank at least has the house. If you go bad on a credit card, that money just disappears. So it's quite different. There wasn't a whole lot of modeling per se to do on the consumer lending side, just because the amount of data and collateral brings kind of an interesting piece into that. So as I mentioned, primarily I helped just to modify policies on that side. And after 3 years in the consumer lending area, I moved back to credit card. I kind of spent my time in consumer lending. There wasn't a whole lot more that they needed, as far as a lot of it was just to reporting. So a lot of automated SaaS reports. And so I moved back to the credit card side. Here I helped maintain and develop new strategies. So I was on, the very first role I was on the modeling team. The second role back in credit card I was on the strategy team. So the strategies that we were responsible for are giving credit line increases to customers, giving credit line decreases to high-risk customers, closing accounts that were high risk. There's different authorization strategies, which if you're not in the credit card industry, I never even thought about. But every time you swipe your card, a decision's made. So your entire profile could be considered. If it's a high-risk transaction, meaning it looks maybe fraudulent, it could be declined. If you're trying to exceed your credit limit, a decision's made based on what your profile looks like. If you've missed a payment on your card, again, a decision's made. So it's all these strategies that go into, is that transaction profitable? Is that customer really legit for it? Or is it going to end up being a loss for the bank? There's a lot more strategies that I can't think of right now. When you make a payment to the credit card, banks have the ability to hold that payment if they question if it's going to be a good payment or a bad payment. So there are strategies behind that, how legit we think the customer is, of whether we maybe hold that payment for 5 days till we think it's going to clear from the bank.
What types of, are there formal statistical methods being used to
Yes.
in those strategies?
Yep, so we primarily do decision trees. So chi-square decision trees. A lot of it, too, we'll do segmentation prior to doing a decision tree. So as I mentioned with like the credit line decreases, we first have to identify who we think our high-risk population is. So we'll use different scoring and different models that'll go into to identify that high-risk population. And then we'll build a strategy out on them of how much do we want to decrease them? Do we want to give them another shot kind of until they start going delinquent? So there's a lot of segmentation involved as well.
So, in other words, you're doing a lot of putting people into categories.
Yes, exactly. And then in building out the tree, it's just dropping those categories into more specific groupings.
Sure.
So, are there any other questions so far?
Yes. Is there any formal economic or finance modeling done in these teams?
Not specifically in a portfolio management team, but there is a lot of modeling done in finance. Finance is primarily where they would do predicting losses. So they take in a lot of the different economic models into consideration when forecasting. And then in a different team from what I was on with First National Bank, we did have a full loss forecasting team that was outside of finance. So they were really building predictive models, including bankruptcy trends, unemployment trends, adding all this other information in to see if they could get their losses more accurate. And then finance was doing their whole separate financial piece. They'd come together and come up with agreed loss rates for the bank.
So did they have people employed with a master's or PhD in economics?
Yes. The manager of that loss forecasting team had a PhD in econ. Some of the analysts either had certificates or masters in statistics.
Okay. So a joint PhD in statistics and econ
Yes.
probably would be.
Yeah, there's I would say of the analysts that I've worked with throughout my career, it's probably about half and half statistics background or econ background. So there's a lot of people that come in with that econ application. After I left First National Bank, as I mentioned, we moved out to the Denver area. Nordstrom is really one of the companies that I was focusing on when we moved, primarily because it's in the credit card industry. I knew that the job I would be moving into was the same one I'd been doing for the past 3 years at First National, so I knew it would be a very easy transition for me after learning their data and their business model. So I don't do, I would say, a whole lot of different at Nordstrom than what I did in my past role at FNBO. However, Nordstrom is much smaller. At FNBO, we had 4 teams, and it was about 25 analysts. At Nordstrom, we have 5 teams, and it's about 15 analysts. So there's between 2 and 4 analysts per team. We don't have a separate modeling team. So at First National, when I was on that modeling team, we had 13 people, and that was in addition to the 25 analysts on the strategy team. So I am kind of the modeling / strategy person. I work for one manager, and I'm the only analyst on the team right now. So because of my background, I'm responsible for all of our model governance and model management, as well as developing and maintaining strategies for the portfolio. So kind of what I mean in that model management, so I maintain 10 models today. Most of them, because of the size of the portfolio at Nordstrom, most of our models are purchased. So third-party vendors develop models on industry data, and then we apply them to our portfolio. The difference there would be at FNBO, there was a large enough portfolio and a separate modeling team that most of the models were built in-house by people with masters or PhDs in statistics or economics.
So what kind of companies, you said third party?
Yep.
Well, what kind of companies are we talking
So
about that do that?
The most known one, everybody knows what a FICO score is,
Yeah.
right? So Fair Isaac Corporation is the developer of the FICO score. That one is the most prominently used all through the banking industry. They have lots of different versions of the FICO score. So you may go and get an auto loan and they pull your score. Well, your score could be different than the one used by your credit card company to make decisions on your account. So FICO has really tried to customize the scores. So they have different scores for the mortgage industry, for the auto industry, for the credit card industry. And then they also have different scores depending on who the credit bureau is that is using your information. So the main credit bureaus you may have heard of are Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. Unfortunately, with how credit bureaus work, they could all have different information on you. All the issuers and everybody that you get loans through reports differently to credit bureaus. Some people, like let's say real small issuers or like a credit union, might only report your account to the credit bureau that they primarily use. So your account might only show up on your TransUnion credit bureau and not your Experian credit bureau. So FICO has customized models for each one of those bureaus based on the information that they have on you.
So when you say you maintain the models, do they give you they somehow give you the model and you essentially score it for an individual?
It depends.
Okay.
FICO is very proprietary, so we do not know the exact factors that are in the models. They tell us very general. So what I mean by maintaining that model is we do a lot of validations on it and do a lot of reporting on it to make sure. So with all of the models, the primary predictor is your odds of going bad. And everybody has different definitions of going bad, but essentially it means you stop paying your bill. So with FICO, if you have a score, let's say of 700, there's predicted odds of what your bad rate is. So you have a 30 to 1 chance of going bad if you have a score of 700, let's say just in general. So a lot of the models are built that way, so they're all logistic regression, but they're scorecards. So there's segmentation involved, so there's a different scorecard built for, let's say, maybe 8 different segments, depending on how they segmented the population. When it's something like FICO, you're talking about the U.S. population, they have a lot of different segments. And then they build a separate model for each one of those segments, and then each variable that's in the model gets binned. So depending on your characteristic, let's say you've never had a delinquent account in the entire history of your credit. So then you would get X amount of points because you fall in this segment and you have 0 delinquencies ever on your history. And then, so each variable you get certain points for. All the points get added up, and that's your total score. So, and that's how I would say the vast majority of credit scoring works. It's all binning variables and then just adding up to a score.
Sure.
So FICO would be the most well-known one. We also use, so we use FICO at time of application, which is what you would expect, if you were to go get a loan or a credit card. But we also use it on the back end to manage the portfolio. So let's say you walked in the door, you applied for a credit card, your score was 740. We gave you this great credit card line, and a year later your score is now 620. So 620, with the way they rank, higher is better. So we pull your score again, a year later you're a 620. Now you have a $10,000 line out there with a 620 credit score saying you're pretty high risk. That's where we start in with our strategies. Now we're going to chop your line down. Now we're going to, depending if you have a balance, now if you have a $10,000 balance, we're pretty out of luck. In those situations, we would likely close your account or take away your spending power. So now you're essentially in pay down, and we're hoping you pay as much of that $10,000 as we can get from you until you stop paying. Otherwise, let's say you had a $5,000 balance. Typically, we would take your credit line down to $5,000, so then you can't get more balance on us because we know you're a fairly high-risk customer now. The strategy maintenance and development is fairly similar to what I was doing at First National. As I mentioned, all the credit line and authorization type strategies are really how we maintain the portfolio once we have people on the book. And then ad hoc analysis is really whatever your manager tells you to do. So it's really, we put together, let's say, a report, and the delinquencies in one of our FICO buckets has increased. Tell us why. Okay, so you go and start digging and try and find, the reason why something's popping on a report. Most likely because our managers have to take it to our board, and the board's going to ask. So we have to give our managers as much information as possible for them to inform the board of why something's happening. So there's a lot of that, I would say. So my typical day at work. So what I've kind of gone over is more general of what my responsibilities are as a whole. But typically, a day at work consists of, I sit at a computer most of the day, other than going to meetings. Every single day, I'm using SAS, and most days I'm using Excel as well. SAS is very different than, how we learn to do everything in college. We're not inputting data sets or importing data sets. We're tapping into databases, and a lot of times pulling hundreds of thousands or millions of records, really just depending on what analysis you're trying to do. If we're talking about authorization data, which is where I spend a lot of my time, you're talking about every single time somebody swipes a card. So there's hundreds of millions of transactions that happen. So if I'm looking at a 12-month period or an 18-month period, there is a lot of data there to sift through. So it's definitely not, data lines.
Or cards.
Yeah, exactly. So one thing that I did have to learn in the industry was SQL coding. So there's a program out there called Microsoft SQL, which is what a lot of places use to get into databases. SAS also has SQL coding. So it's proc SQL is how we connect to all of our databases. And then I use SQL a lot in place of data steps. So if you look at how I code today, 8 years after being in industry and being out of school, I don't use a lot of what we learned as far as data steps, proc frequencies, proc summaries, proc means. Proc SQL does a lot of that for you, and as soon as you understand the syntax, it can do it all in one step. So then
What
it's
is the
not
advantage? What's an advantage of using it?
of using proc SQL. So especially when we're talking about large data sets, something I do really frequently is just get frequencies out of my data steps, but I want several different class variables. So I'll categorize my data maybe by 8 different dimensions. So in proc SQL, I can say, give me a count, and then I can tell you all of my categorical variables and say group by, and then it gives me just basically a big proc frequency by all of those 8 dimensions. And that's where Excel really comes in. When I have a large data set, it's definitely not that I group by 8 variables. Sometimes it's by 50 variables. So then we dump that summarized data into Excel and use what are called pivot tables. I never used a pivot table before I got into working. So pivot tables are really Excel's way of letting you mine data. So you can put this large summarized data set into a pivot table, and then it's just a big crosstab essentially. So then you can pull down individual variables as you need them. You can filter. You can do all kinds of stuff through that pivot table. So between proc SQL and pivot tables, that's probably the majority of my common day, especially when I'm doing a big analysis. Knowledge Seeker is another software that we've used. This one is just kind of a run-of-the-mill, I would say. There's lots of different vendors out there with strategy building software. The idea is to make it for non-statisticians, so it's a lot of point and click. It's very easy to work through. So this is the software that I currently use, but at First National I use several different strategy building tools as well. So Knowledge Seeker is you really put your data, you upload your data into it, and then you tell it that you want to build a decision tree based off of predicting bads. So the first step would be, okay, give me the first variable that separates my goods and bads the best. So most of the time we have a lot of models or a lot of segmentation already in our data set. So the biggest segmentation that I use, I'd worked on at First National, and then I have also developed one at Nordstrom, is predicting people's probability of going bad based on using their FICO score, and then also based on using an internally developed behavior score is what we call it. So the behavior score only looks at your behavior on that card. So like our behavior score is only your performance on your Nordstrom card. Do you pay on time? How do you utilize your line? All kinds of different information. Whereas FICO score is based off of your credit bureau. So it's your behavior on every single trade line you have on your credit bureau. So we do what we call a dual score matrix between those scores. So to show an example. So you have your FICO score, low to high, and your behavior score, low to high. So if you have a low behavior score and a low FICO score, you're pretty high risk. Both scores are scaled similarly, that higher is better. So these are your high risk people, these are your lowest risk people. But then you have all these people in between that are showing different types of behavior on different types of trades. So these people have a really high behavior score on you, but maybe a low FICO score. You can see this a lot, especially when you're thinking of someplace like Nordstrom. I want to be able to use my Nordstrom card to shop at Nordstrom. I'm going to make sure and pay my bill. However, maybe they have an auto loan or other credit cards on their bureau that they've fallen behind on. So these are kind of a medium risk, but in a different way than the people that are in this medium risk. So these people have really high FICOs, but for some reason they can't get it together on their Nordstrom card. Maybe they're, they constantly miss payments, but they pay within like 5 days of their due date. So there's something going on that makes them a little bit more high risk on our card, but they're showing that on their overall bureau they're pretty reliable. So this is also kind of a medium risk. So this is really how we classify and start segmenting at the highest level. And these scores have a lot of information in them as well. So you're taking so much information on each of these customers, really generalizing it into each of those scores, and then we're putting those scores together in the matrix to categorize. So again, in Knowledge Seeker, we'd use that segmentation as the very highest level because we're using our most powerful scores for that matrix. So we'd say, okay, give me the separation of goods to bads as much as possible, and you'd likely get those categories as your very highest level of segmentation. So you're going to have your low risk, your medium risk, and your high risk, and then you're going to be able to, depending on what strategy you're building, let's say credit line decreases, then you're really going to be able to focus on your high risk because that's where the majority of your bad customers are going to fall. Any questions on that? I know it's very high level. It's hard to picture, but other duties that I have during the day, working through assigned projects, answering questions that come up from upper management. As I said, we do some reporting, so there's questions that come up from the reporting. We're also on large project teams. When we go to change a strategy, sometimes it means involving technology, depending on if the systems are ready for the strategy change that we're recommending. So right now I'm on a large project team because we're changing all of our systems in process of putting in a new strategy. So there's a lot of different departments involved. Sometimes putting in new strategies means we have to communicate to the customers differently than we have before. So the banking industry is very, very complex because we're regulated by the government. So there's a lot of very specific communication that has to go out to stay compliant with our regulators. There's a lot of laws involved. If you've ever gotten a letter from your bank, it's probably because of some regulation. Even if you go and apply for a loan and they have to give you all kinds of disclosures at the front end, that's all due to regulation as well. So there's a lot to keep up with. Regulations are constantly changing. One of the biggest ones that impacts us almost daily is when the whole recession started hitting in 2010, Congress created a bill called the Dodd-Frank Act. So it started requiring us to collect income anytime we make credit decisions. So anytime you extend credit. So prior to 2010, if you would have gone and applied for a credit card, income wasn't required. We looked at your credit scores and said, you're low risk, here's your $10,000, enjoy. The frustrating thing with this is that it's been proven time and time again that income and risk are not correlated. So it's frustrating because it makes making decisions much more difficult when you have to have somebody's income. When we have all this other information that tells us so much more about a customer than what their income is.
Is this self-reported income or?
Yes.
Okay. So that's correct.
Thanks.
Okay.
So there's been a lot of, after that 2010 change, everybody in the industry started trying to create, okay, what can we do? Because there's millions and millions of customers out there. How do we get income? So a lot of places started trying to model income. How can we predict your income based on the information that we have on your bureau? Well, that got poo-pooed fairly quickly. That modeled income wasn't good enough. We have to have customer stated income. But customer stated income is only about 80% accurate. So there's just been a lot of changes as regulations come down on various things, different things we have to do. A couple of UNL experiences that I jotted down that I think really helped and applied to the career that I chose. The biggest thing I think is just communicating. You have to communicate with your upper management every day. So make sure you take advantage of communicating with your professors and your other students, and get comfortable with that. One of the biggest things that we ask candidates when we interview is, are you comfortable presenting? It's 100% required by every analyst that I work with. You have, even if it's just to your coworkers, you have to be able to present and communicate your ideas. You can't just sit in a corner, crunch numbers, and call it good. You have to be able to let people know what you're thinking, maybe even walk people through the process that you went through in your analysis. But then you've also got to be able to simplify that down, because there's a lot of upper management, they don't have statistics backgrounds. They've been in business for 20 or 30 years. So they want to be able to understand your ideas, but in a simplified way.
I suppose having teaching experience is something that you look at.
Yeah. I personally look at, nobody else looks at, but
well, I mean, if you teach it, then that's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. Having teaching experience personally, that was something that, I found valuable. The first couple of times I had to stand up in front of an audience and present, a lot of coworkers and management was like, wow, you did a really good job. And I'm like, well, I've been doing this for 2 years. I've been able to get comfortable in front of an audience because I had to speak to students. But it's definitely something that will be an advantage. Another one is the broad base of statistical theories. Chris and I were talking before we came in here. It's very difficult because statistics is so broad. You can go into a lot of different industries. So it would be difficult in school to learn exactly what you're going to be doing on a day-to-day basis, and really learning all the techniques that you'll need. As I said, I did never use pivot tables. That was one of the very first things that I had to learn on the job. I never used SQL coding before. It was everywhere. However, I did have the advantage of reusing a lot of other people's code. It was like, okay, you're going to take over this process. Here's the code to do it. So I was able to learn a lot of the coding by using other people's coding. And then, of course, there's people all around you that have been there longer than you. So that was a huge advantage as well, just learning from other people. The weekly seminars, I think you still do those?
Yes.
Yes, okay. It just really helps to understand the applications. Obviously, a class like this is going to really broaden your perspective on what's available to go into. I really had no idea, what kinds of things I would be doing in the banking industry. I started my college career thinking I wanted to do actuarial science, got into one insurance class, and said, I don't think this is for me. But I knew that I wanted to do numbers, and I wanted to, look at customer information. But I wasn't, at the same time, I wasn't really interested as much in the marketing side. So eventually, through many different roles, I found the niche that I wanted to be in the portfolio management. And then lastly, working together with fellow students really helps simulate the work environment. There has been very few situations where I work on a project all by myself. There's lots of times where I either need input from a coworker who's done something similar in the past, or we're working together on something and we have to share duties. It's pretty much similar to when we were in school working on homework together, trying to use somebody else's knowledge to better yourself. So. Just a couple things that I wish I had learned. I had a hard time coming up with this one. But really, I hadn't worked with the types of large data sets that I work with today. When I was in school, we were inputting a lot of our data sets, or maybe just even importing an Excel file or a text file. As I mentioned, we tap into databases, and sometimes I can work with hundreds of millions of records just in one analysis.
I'm curious, so are these large databases stored on Linux servers, and then you use a Windows-based computer to access them, or?
So I can't remember what we were stored on at First National. At Nordstrom, we're stored on Oracle.
Okay.
So they are data warehouses, so they are not raw data. Typically, our IT teams will read in the raw data and format it and get it into usable tables for the analysts to consume.
Okay.
So, and yeah, I can't remember. Oh, on at First National, it was DB2. So yeah, but ProcSQL is what we use to get into everything.
And you're using a Windows-based?
It's all through SAS.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I mean,
Yeah.
you have a Windows computer.
Yes. Yep. And then the last one, as I mentioned, I use pivot tables a ton. I didn't know anything about pivot tables prior to working, and really I didn't know a whole lot about Excel. I'd done some really basic things in Excel. There's a lot of people in the industry that code in Excel, and I didn't know what that was. I knew how to use Excel for just really basic things, random number generation, adding columns, just really simple things.
Sorry, I keep running.
No, go ahead.
When you say code, are you talking about using Visual Basic, or are you talking about using macros?
Macros.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, but there's also a lot of analysis capabilities in Excel that I just hadn't used before going into the workforce. So you kind of have heard where my focus has been. Other opportunities in similar industry. So as I mentioned, I was on a model development team for a short amount of time. But I'm more interested in really the application of the models, which is why I'm more interested in the portfolio management side. So I'm no longer really developing the models, but I'm using them. And you have to have a good understanding of how they are developed in order to use them properly. And then credit risk is where I primarily have my focus. So credit risk would be anything giving positive or negative treatments to customers based on their risk profiles, which we identify by scores. Loss forecasting, as I briefly mentioned before, there's a lot of focus in the banking industry on where are we going. So budgets are created sometimes a couple years out of what do we expect our income to be, as well as what do we expect our losses to be based on the profiles of the portfolio that we have. So a lot of that, you're looking at delinquency levels, you're looking at even score distributions of your portfolio to determine how high risk it is, to predict how many of those balances you think are going to be bad balances. As I mentioned, we don't have to charge off customer accounts until they are 6 months delinquent, so you have some prediction. Your 6-month loss forecasts should be right on, because you already know those people are delinquent up front. But once you start trying to forecast 2 years out, regulations require a lot more focus on loss forecasting, and then they also require large issuers to stress test. So the government comes up with all these crazy scenarios. What if unemployment goes to 8%? And what if this goes to this? And what if this goes to this? How will it affect your losses? So all of those things have to be considered when trying to forecast. Finance and accounting. I'm not 100% sure all the modeling techniques that finance and accounting use, because I haven't really taken any finance or accounting classes. I know when we work with the finance teams, they always have to give us a cost-benefit analysis of what our strategies are going to do. So they have to predict revenues on accounts, and then apply it to how our strategies are going to impact that. Fraud detection is another big one that uses a lot of modeling techniques. Third-party vendors, again, are big for this one. Visa is one of the largest issuers in the world, so they have enormous amounts of data because every time you swipe your Visa, not only does your issuer get that data, Visa also gets that data. So they build out fraud models to predict whether a transaction is fraudulent or not. So then we purchase those models and use those models in our strategies to decide if we're going to approve or decline transactions. Suspicious transactions. There's lots and lots of regulations surrounding money laundering and identifying money laundering quickly and appropriately because we have to report that to the government. Whether we think somebody is, one process that was fairly common with Nordstrom specifically is purchasing items on your credit card and then returning them to a different form of tender, so not putting it back on your Nordstrom card. So sometimes they were returning items for cash. You never know where that cash goes, and then they were going delinquent on their credit card. So then we have big balances that you don't know where the money actually went. So there's a lot of situations where you have to identify quickly if it's suspicious because somebody's just not being honest, or if it's suspicious because there may be money laundering or other activity involved. And then one that we briefly had talked about too is experimental design for testing. So we talked about it in the context of doing campaigns for marketing. But another context for testing is anytime we do look at putting new strategies in, we typically want to test them to make sure they are going to be better than the strategy that's currently in place on the portfolio. So we do a lot of discussions on what we want the power of the test to be, what our sample sizes need to be able to read out, anything like that. We do, in certain types of tests, we also keep controls to see, okay, we're going to take this action on a customer, but what if we hadn't? What if we let the customers just be as they are? Will they perform different than our test groups? There's a lot involved. And then just really, most automated decisions in the industry are really based off of models or strategies. So I think not a whole lot of people know that, but the credit card industry is all based off of data and models. And the big issuers, primarily Chase, Bank of America, Citibank, they have hundreds of analysts that all have, statistics or econ backgrounds that are their big machines. So, just some general advice. What time are we? We've got a couple minutes.
It's 1:48 or 1:48.
11:48.
1:40. So we have a few minutes. You
Okay.
Keep on going.
Okay. So just general advice. Keep good notes. I have dug out notes and textbooks several times. Google is always your friend. SAS has great websites. If you need help with syntax for coding, I'm always going to the SAS website. But there's definitely times when it's like, oh, I know we did this in school. How did we go about doing it? So I've definitely dug out those binders. Internships offer a great trial period. I unfortunately didn't do any internships specifically when I was in grad school. I spent a lot of my focus in social sciences, so I was spending a lot of time over there with research projects. But I think if you're interested in the field and you're between your first and second year, or even afterwards, the experience won't hurt you for sure. Even if it's something you decide you want to go into, it's good to have on your resume because it's really, I think it's getting harder and harder for companies to hire new grads. So having something to be able to say, I did this, even if it's for 2 or 3 months, it will benefit you.
So does Nordstrom or First National Bank have interns where they would look for someone with a staff background?
First National definitely does.
Okay.
Nordstrom, we're too small. We keep trying to get them to let us hire interns, so we have somebody to do our grunt work, and they won't let us. But First National has internship programs where they even let you do rotations around the bank. So then you can kind of get a flavor depending on where you think you'd want to work. And then just mentoring relationships. That's one big thing I always try and find, especially when I move to companies. You know, so use your professors as mentors while you have them. When you get into a job, have that be one of your first requests from your manager, is that you want a mentor. A lot of times you'll get placed with people that just have been at the company longer and know how to navigate the company landscape. Every company has a very different culture. And then it's always good to have somebody to bounce ideas off. If I have, you know, maybe a bad conversation with my manager, I can take it to my mentor and say, how should I have handled this different? Or what can I do next time to have a better interaction?
I think it's probably a sign of a good company when they do automatically assign that mentor. They set that up because it shows that they want to retain you.
Yeah.
And if you go to a company that doesn't have that, then you might start thinking, I'm a little worried.
Yeah, and sometimes, honestly, at the analyst level, you do get a little bit forgotten because there's so many analysts, and there's a lot of turnover with analysts as well. So if you go in and make that one of your first requests, they'll get you lined up with somebody, whereas a lot of the mentoring programs I've been a part of are for more senior level people. And so it's like, you know, I wasn't a part of those until, I don't know, I'd probably been at First National 5 or 6 years. And then it was my manager had to nominate me to be a part of the mentoring program. So, but if you have an informal, you know, if you make the request and have an informal relationship, you'll still benefit from it just the same. So that was actually when I moved to Nordstrom and I asked my managers for that one. They're like, wow, that, you know, like, we like that idea. I'm like, I need somebody. You know, like, it's amazing the relationship you can develop with that mentor, and you know, so you can talk about personal stuff with them if needed. At First National, when I decided I wanted to change jobs, you know, I went to my mentor a lot. How do I approach my manager about quitting? How do I, you know, go through the interview process without making it obvious that I'm about to leave a job I've been at for 7 years? You know, so it's really helpful for them to navigate through that.
So
Sorry, I rambled a lot, but questions?
I know we're a little bit over, but if there are questions. Well, let me ask you this question then. Master's versus PhD. There's going to be a lot of students here are trying to decide between them. Mm-hmm. How did you make the decision, and do you have any recommendations regarding that?
I made the decision mostly because I felt that I was ready to go into the workforce. You know, I had several other people that were moving on to a PhD, and it was definitely something I toyed with. But as I looked at the industry more, a master's was going to be sufficient for what I felt I wanted to do. And so I just didn't think that it was maybe necessary to go on for the PhD.
Are there many people with PhDs in statistics in your area?
No. There's a couple people with PhDs in economics that I've come across, but I rarely see somebody with a PhD in statistics.
Okay.
So, yeah.
At what point in your education did you decide you wanted to go specifically into banking?
When I was interviewing for jobs.
Okay.
I mean, really, I didn't have, as Chris and I were kind of talking, I, you know, did sociology undergrad because I just was interested in the classes. And then in grad school, a lot of my electives were still in the social sciences, but I never had an intention of going that direction. It was just interesting to me. So it was really in the interview process. I interviewed with Mutual of Omaha. The job they had just didn't seem like what I wanted to do. And again, I knew from my insurance class experience that maybe wasn't the route I wanted to go. I interviewed with Cabela's with their credit card. And then I also interviewed with a market research company. But just hearing kind of what they said my role would be, First National just seemed like the most interesting. And
could I ask you why you are interested in banking industry? How would you answer?
I really am interested in how customers react to things. really just the customer behavior, which is why the marketing side didn't seem quite as interesting to me, because the marketing side is really trying to acquire new customers, and that's what all the mail you get constantly. It's what's going to get customers to react. Whereas the portfolio management side of banking is really looking at customers and how they behave, and how can you modify that behavior to make their accounts more profitable for the bank.
So it's related to what you learned in school.
Yeah, it definitely is related, but just kind of in a weird way.
I think one of the key things is that you didn't necessarily have finance experience before going into that. And I find this with a lot of areas that statisticians go into, is that they don't have experience in that application.
Mm-hmm.
But since there's such a strong demand for statisticians,
Mm-hmm.
you can find jobs in that. And so one way that maybe you can differentiate yourself as a student is that if you decide that you want to go in this area, see if you can get some of that experience, and that might give you a leg up on or another candidate.
Definitely. When we're interviewing candidates, it is so hard to find people with the right technical background, with the right experience. And, I mean, we, especially at Nordstrom being small, they're very specific on we want to find the right person, because you're going to be on a team of 2 or 3 other people. It's very difficult to hire somebody that's not going to work out in 6 months or a year, because now you've wasted a year on somebody that's now gone and you got to start over. So it's, they're looking for something very specific, and the technical background is really the hardest thing to find. A lot of people, well, I want to do this, but I don't know SAS. And it's like, okay, well, we use SAS every day, and I don't have the next 6 months to sit down and teach you SAS. So at least having the knowledge of, you have to have a semicolon at the end of your line, just like even the basics of SAS, to be able to look at somebody else's code and modify it to what you need is very necessary.
Do you find anybody who you interview who has R experience, a lot of R experience, but not the SAS experience?
Some, but R is really difficult in the banking industry specifically, because we're dealing with personal information, and R can't link up to our databases because of firewalls and all kinds of stuff. So we do have, like right now, we have somebody who's in grad school while he's working, and he really wants to use R. So he's really gung-ho about using R. Well, that means he has to cleanse his data, he has to get it all prepared from SAS, put it in a text file, and get it into R to do his analysis. And it's like, by the time you did all of that, why didn't you just do it in SAS? And not a lot of people know R. So to be able for him to pass on work or to save work out for others to use, the other person's just going to start over in SAS. So industry is really, every place that I've heard as far as analysis goes, everybody's using SAS and or some type of SQL.
And at least from what I've seen for trends for departments of statistics, more and more going towards R versus SAS.
Yeah.
I wonder how that's going to affect things in the future.
Yeah, I think if all the security issues could be remedied, R might be able to make a place for itself. But we have people's social security numbers, and we have people's addresses and phone numbers and birth dates, and we have so much focus on data security anymore. So especially with all the breaches.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So like everything in that I can view is all tokenized, is what we call it. So when I pull somebody's social, it's not really their social security number. I have to send a file to IT to detokenize. And when I pull somebody's credit card number, it's not the actual number that's on their card in their hand. It's all tokenized. So it's just different, interesting.
Okay, well, we thank Leanne. If you had more questions or have more questions, I'm sure we can. You can feel free to ask Leanne right here. But sorry that I kept you over. But again, you're getting
sorry
more,
that I rambled.
No, you're getting more for your money by sticking around.
Talk about it all day.